April 2008, Aurora, Illinois. Charlotte Reyes was 27, a nurse finishing her night shift at Rush Copley Medical Center. Just before 1 in the morning, she walked to the parking lot, got into her Honda Civic, and drove toward home. She usually called her husband after work, but that night her phone stayed silent. By sunrise, Charlotte had not shown up for her next shift. Her family knew something was wrong. They called police immediately. Her car was missing, no sign of her on the roads. Search teams moved fast along the Fox River, combing the banks and nearby highways. Flyers went up across town. Reporters pressed for answers. But in those first days, nothing broke open. Investigators turned to people around her. A coworker, John Miller, was questioned after witnesses recalled heated arguments with Charlotte. His home and car were searched. DNA was taken, but no evidence tied him to her disappearance. Rumors spread through the city, but the trail soon went cold. For years, the case sat in storage. Each April, her family held vigils by the river. Her husband, Daniel, spoke on television, begging for answers. Their young son grew up only with questions. Was this an accident, or something darker? No one knew. Then, in 2022, everything changed. Volunteer divers using sonar found a car deep in the Fox River. When it was pulled from the mud, the truth surfaced. Inside was Charlotte's Honda Civic, her nurse's jacket, her purse, and DNA that did not belong to her. This was no accident. This was a crime hidden underwater for 15 years. The discovery reopened the case, and with it came the shocking name of a suspect no one expected. Miguel Ramirez, a neighbor who had stood beside the Reyes family during their years of grief. His arrest stunned the community and set the stage for a trial that would finally deliver justice. This is the story of Charlotte Reyes, a disappearance that haunted Illinois, a cold case revived by technology, and a family that never gave up. Stay with us as we follow the investigation, the evidence, and the trial that exposed the truth. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Charlotte Reyes was 27 years old, a nurse at Rush Copley Medical Center. She had just finished another long night shift. Shortly before 1 in the morning, she walked across the hospital parking lot and got into her silver Honda Civic. The lot was quiet. Security cameras later confirmed she drove out onto the road heading home. Charlotte had a routine. After late shifts, she called her husband, Daniel, while driving. That night, her phone never rang. Hours later, when daylight came, her silence became the first sign something was terribly wrong. By 6 a.m., she had not shown up for her next scheduled shift. Colleagues noticed her absence immediately. Charlotte was known to be punctual, dependable, the type who never missed work without warning. Concern grew quickly. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Text messages never delivered. Her husband checked their home. She wasn't there. Within hours, her family contacted Aurora police. At first, investigators treated the situation as a possible delay or misunderstanding. But within the first day, troubling details surfaced. Charlotte's phone had been switched off minutes after she left the hospital parking lot. The silver Honda Civic was not seen anywhere along her usual route home. No sign of her at gas stations, convenience stores, or traffic cameras nearby. Aurora police escalated the case to a missing persons search. Patrol units drove the roads between the hospital and her home. Volunteers and officers walked the banks of the Fox River, fearing the car might have veered off the road. Boats were sent out to scan the shoreline. Flyers with Charlotte's photo spread across the neighborhoods. By the end of the day, local news stations had picked up the story. "Young nurse missing after night shift" ran across television screens in northern Illinois. Anchors highlighted the sudden disappearance, and detectives canvassed the hospital parking lot. Security cameras confirmed Charlotte leaving alone. No suspicious figures appeared on tape. No other cars clearly followed hers from the lot. Police checked nearby traffic cameras, but the technology in 2008 was limited and resolution was poor. One blurry clip showed headlights trailing her vehicle, but investigators could not make out a license plate or even confirm the make of the car. Attention turned to her route home. It was a short drive, less than 15 minutes, but lined with dark stretches of road. Officers stopped passing drivers, asking if anyone had seen a silver sedan or a woman pulled over that night. No one recalled anything unusual. Meanwhile, volunteers expanded the search. Dozens walked trails near the Fox River. Teams searched abandoned lots and wooded areas. Helicopters scanned from above. Still, there was nothing. No broken glass, no tire tracks, no pieces of clothing. As day turned to night, speculation began. Some suggested an accident, that her car may have gone off-road into water or woods. Others whispered darker theories, pointing to the possibility of abduction. By the end of the second day, Aurora police acknowledged that the case was more than just a missing person alert. It was a potential crime scene without a crime scene. Evidence was scarce, witnesses were non-existent. The timeline between leaving the hospital and vanishing was painfully thin. Local media pressed investigators for updates, but there was little to share. The missing car became the central clue. If they could find the Civic, they might find Charlotte. But without leads, it was like searching blind. In those first critical hours, the community rallied. Churches held prayer gatherings. Neighbors brought food and supplies for volunteers. Flyers were distributed not just in Aurora, but in surrounding towns and in Chicago. Yet, despite the urgency, the first 24 hours closed with no progress. Charlotte had vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of questions that investigators could not answer. The following days would only bring more frustration, as every search ended in dead ends. What began as a frantic manhunt was already sliding into uncertainty, the kind that detectives start with the last routine moments of her life. They confirm the night shift at Rush Copley Medical Center. They pull badge logs to verify clock-out time. They collect the parking lot footage, the exit camera, and the street camera facing the road out of the hospital. They note the exact minute Charlotte's phone goes dark. The span between the lot and the first dead zone is short. Too short. It suggests intent or contact. It gives them a narrow window to work with. They run the basic drill, family first, then co-workers, then neighbors. Daniel, the husband, opens the house. He hands over phone records, bank statements, computer access. Nothing shows planning to leave, no flights, no cash withdrawals, no packed bag. He stays in the room during some of the early briefings, a witness and a source of routine details, routes, habits, places where she stopped for gas. Detectives document it and keep moving. Within hours, a familiar name comes up from hospital staff. John Miller, 29, a colleague. People remember raised voices a few weeks earlier. It was about schedule swaps and charting coverage during a short-staffed weekend. A nurse who worked that floor tells detectives, "They argued. It wasn't personal, it was pressure. We were drowning in patients that week." Another colleague adds, "John sometimes took things too far. He'd push back hard when he thought he was right." The words are not evidence, but they point investigators toward a first real interview. On April 15th, detectives bring John to the station for a formal sit-down. He does not ask for an attorney. He says he was home the night Charlotte disappeared. He names his girlfriend as his alibi. Detectives check the timeline against phone records. They see calls between the two around midnight, then a gap, then more calls near 2 in the morning. The gap is not proof of anything, but it leaves room for questions. They press him for details, TV shows, takeout orders, the exact time he went to bed. He offers answers that sound rehearsed, then revises a few when detectives point out small conflicts. They take a DNA swab with his consent. Phone analysts pull Charlotte's call detail records. They map the final tower hits between the hospital and home. The phone dies fast. That can mean she powered it off or someone else did. It can also mean a sudden drop or damage. The team notes the possibilities, but holds back on conclusions. They request historical subscriber information for numbers that hit the same tower at the same time window. The list is long. They prioritize numbers belonging to people within 1 degree of Charlotte, coworkers from that shift, neighbors who live along her route, and prior contacts from her call history. Detectives return to John Miller. They ask for consent to search his computer and phone. He agrees. His text messages show complaints about staffing, frustration about last-minute schedule changes, and a few snide comments about management decisions. There is nothing that reads like a threat. The email threads match the hospital's chaotic tone from that month. The forensic review finds no deleted content tied to Charlotte's name or number. Nothing marks him as the person who intercepted her on the road. The girlfriend's statement supports his alibi. She says he was at her apartment most of the evening, left for a short time to get soda from a nearby convenience store, and came back. The timestamp on her building's security camera confirms him entering at 11:28 p.m. The convenience store receipt shows a purchase at 11:41 p.m. The distance between the store and her building fits. There is still an unaccounted stretch around 12:20 to 12:45 a.m., which he says they spent watching television. The building's interior cameras do not cover the living room. Detectives mark the gap as unverified, but also mark the rest of the timeline as consistent. The lab calls in preliminary results. No blood detected in John's car. No fibers consistent with Charlotte's work uniform on his seats. No trace hits on luminol in the trunk. The DNA swab goes into the system to compare with any later evidence. For now, there is no link. Detectives release John. They keep him in the case file as previously interviewed, not as an active suspect. Meanwhile, media pressure grows. The department assigns more bodies to the case. Detectives split into teams and canvass her route again in daylight. They identify blind spots where streetlights flicker or bushes hide parts of the road. They knock on doors near those zones. At one house, a resident remembers hearing an engine idling late that night, longer than usual, then a fast acceleration. No one sees a face. No one writes down a plate. The note goes into the file, small, imperfect, but real. Traffic investigators run all registered silver Honda Civics in the county and surrounding areas. They confirm none was found abandoned or towed in the last 2 days. They contact tow yards, scrap facilities, and private lots. Nothing. They expand the net to waterways, culverts, and embankments. Boats go out again on the Fox River. The river is high and cold. Visibility is poor. Sonar resources are limited. The search yields no car, no debris. Digital forensics widen. Analysts reconstruct Charlotte's last week, work emails, calendar entries, and calls. There are no anonymous threats, no dramatic disputes beyond normal staff friction. The nursing supervisor gives a statement. She describes Charlotte as steady and focused, helpful with newer nurses. She also confirms the recent staffing tension. The supervisor's exact words matter. "We were all at the edge." People said things they didn't mean. That context keeps the argument with John in perspective. Stress can sound like motive. It rarely is. Detectives look at patient families and prior incidents in the ER. Sometimes conflict spills past the hospital walls. They review incident reports for aggressive visitors or complaints that named Charlotte. A few confrontations appear in the logs, but none tie to a person with means or opportunity on the night she vanished. The team checks those names anyway. They find alibis that hold. They move on. They speak with a security guard who worked the lot that night. He remembers Charlotte walking out alone, carrying her bag low, head down from fatigue. He did not see anyone approach her. He says, "It was a normal exit. Nothing about it felt strange until the next morning." His days slide by. The case begins to stall. Each interview narrows possibilities but does not name a path. Detectives return to the original images. They request raw dumps of the hospital's full camera set and ask the city to preserve traffic frames from adjacent intersections, not just the direct route home. They look for alternate paths she might have taken. A technician stabilizes a night shot clip frame by frame and produces a slightly clearer silhouette of the second vehicle. It resembles a pickup based on height and headlight spread, but the file lacks the resolution to confirm make or color. The note reads, "Possible pickup trailing at approximately 1:02 a.m., unable to ID." Back at the lab, the items taken from John's apartment come back clean. The DNA sample sits in evidence, marked for future comparison if anything turns up in Charlotte's car or clothing, if those items ever surface. Without that match, the early theory that workplace conflict escalated on the road loses force. Detectives check incoming tips. Most are noise. A few are worth a call. One man claims he saw a woman arguing with a driver at a gas station near midnight. Camera footage proves it was a different person, different night. Another caller says he heard a cry near the river. The timeline does not fit. Officers document it anyway. Everything is written down. Everything is kept. Inside the squad room, the main whiteboard lists 3 columns: known facts, unknowns, and next actions. Known. Charlotte left the hospital around 1 in the morning in a silver Honda Civic. Her phone went off soon after. She did not arrive home. Unknown. Where the car went, who she encountered, whether she was forced off the road or lured to stop. Next actions. Deeper camera pulls, expanded river scans when resources allow, continued canvass for private cameras, businesses with old DVR systems that might still hold a week of data, if not yet overwritten. Detectives knock on small shops along side streets. Some owners still have their old tapes. A few hand over dusty drives. Most are blank or looped. One unit records only motion and triggers on passing trucks, not cars. Another system failed during a thunderstorm days earlier. At a small briefing with hospital staff, detectives ask one final round of direct questions. Did anyone see Charlotte being followed in the weeks prior? Did she mention road harassment? A nurse speaks up. She said she felt like someone was behind her a couple of nights, but we all do after midnight. The roads are empty. Headlights look closer than they are. The detail is vague. It does not pinpoint a date or a plate, yet it hints at a pattern that no one could see in real time. The last step of the initial phase is a sweep for electronic toll records, even though her usual route avoids them. Nothing hits. Insurance checks show no claims. DMV databases flag no newly registered silver Civics that appear switched out of her VIN range. It suggests one thing. If the car still exists, it is hidden or destroyed. Without the car, the case lacks the anchor piece that ties events to a place. The community keeps searching. Volunteers push deeper into trails and alleys. Churches host another vigil. A coworker faces the camera outside the hospital and says, "We just want her home. If you know anything, call." Her voice travels across evening news broadcasts and into hundreds of homes. It adds pressure and hope at once. Inside the detective bureau, the file grows thick. Interviews are logged. Evidence is cataloged. Leads are crossed out in red. The list of viable suspects shrinks to almost none. There is no clean line from the hospital lot to a person with motive and opportunity. The case has structure, but no center. The early investigation ends where many do, with careful work, no shortcuts, and no breakthrough. Charlotte's disappearance sits at the edge of known facts, waiting for something solid: a car pulled from water, a DNA hit, a clearer frame from a dark camera. The team closes the month with a sober summary. A promising co-worker lead eliminated by evidence. An alibi that holds under pressure. A route that swallows details. A city that now understands how fast a life can go missing between two lights on a quiet road. The next phase will depend on what turns up and when. For now, the file leaves the active board and moves into the rotation. The term everyone avoids in public finally appears in the header. Cold case. By the end of April 2008, the investigation into Charlotte Reyes had stalled. John Miller, the co-worker who seemed like the strongest lead, had been cleared. There was no evidence to connect him to her disappearance. No car, no phone records pointing to a suspect. No trace of Charlotte on the roads she drove that night. For her family, waiting was not an option. They organized their own search. Flyers with Charlotte's photo were printed in stacks and handed out across Aurora. Neighbors, friends, and hospital colleagues joined. At its peak, more than 100 volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder along the Fox River, checking wooded trails, abandoned houses, and small parks. Search teams divided the city into widgets. Some combed fields and parking lots. Others drove rural back roads at night, looking for tire marks or a car that didn't belong. The sense of urgency was everywhere. People brought flashlights, boots, food, and radios. What police resources could not cover, the community filled in. Local churches opened their doors. Weekly vigils began, drawing large crowds. Inside, candles were lit, prayers were read, and Charlotte's photo was placed at the front. Reporters filmed the gatherings. "We just want her home," one neighbor said, holding back tears. Each event became both a show of strength and a reminder of the void. The story spread quickly beyond Aurora. Illinois newspapers ran daily updates. Television stations in Chicago aired the case during evening broadcasts. The headline was simple but striking. "Young nurse missing after night shift." The image of Charlotte, smiling in her hospital uniform, appeared on screens across the state. The Reyes family did everything possible to keep her name in the spotlight. They set up a 24-hour hotline, urging anyone with information to call. Spanish-language flyers were printed to reach Aurora's large Latino population. Volunteers taped them to gas stations, bus stops, restaurants, and schools. Both English and Spanish versions carried the same message: "Help us find Charlotte." Tips began to pour in. Some seemed promising. A man claimed he saw a silver Honda Civic parked outside a warehouse in the suburbs. Detectives rushed to check. Nothing was there. Another call came from someone who said in a low voice, "I know someone is keeping Charlotte." Police traced the number but found it was unregistered, impossible to track. Other leads were even weaker. Tabloids picked up the story and ran headlines about secret affairs and double lives. None of it was backed by evidence. Each rumor only drained time and created noise. The Reyes family tried to stay focused. They coordinated searches with police, but they also pushed on their own. Charlotte's husband, Daniel, appeared on television for the first time. Standing in front of his house, voice heavy with exhaustion, he said, "We just want Charlotte to come home. Please, if you know something, call the police. Don't stay silent." His plea echoed through the evening news. At one vigil, their young son stood beside him, clutching a flyer with his mother's picture. The image spread across newspapers the next day, stirring emotion and sympathy. Community members brought toys and food to support the family. Strangers left flowers on the steps of the Reyes home. For weeks, the cycle continued. New tips, dead ends, more flyers, more prayers. Volunteers checked the same trails again and again, hoping they had missed something the first time. The Fox River became a focal point, with boats scanning its edges repeatedly. But nothing surfaced. By summer, the energy began to fade. The large volunteer groups shrank. Only the most committed stayed, joining the family at weekly searches. Still, the Reyes family refused to let go. Daniel returned to the media every few weeks, giving interviews, reminding the public that Charlotte was still missing. Police, under pressure from both the family and the press, kept resources on the case. But behind closed doors, detectives admitted frustration. Every promising lead dissolved into nothing. The missing Honda Civic remained the most important clue, and without it, the case had no anchor. As the months wore on, the absence of evidence became more crushing. By late fall, detectives had checked hundreds of tips. None held up. Not a single witness had seen Charlotte after she left the hospital. Not a single piece of physical evidence had been found outside of the parking lot footage. In December 2008, with no progress and no new leads, Aurora police made the decision that families dreamed. By the close of 2008, the case of Charlotte Reyes had transformed. What began as an urgent manhunt had become one of Aurora's most haunting mysteries. A nurse leaving work after midnight. A car that never made it home. A family that would not stop searching. And for investigators, a file now marked with 2 words: cold case. By early 2009, nearly a year had passed since Charlotte Reyes disappeared. The search had exhausted every lead. With no car, no phone activity, and no credible witnesses, Aurora police made a difficult move. The case was officially transferred to the cold case unit. Detectives who had worked long hours in the first weeks returned to their regular assignments. A smaller team was left to check in with the family and store the growing stack of reports. For the Reyes family, that announcement did not mean the end. In April 2009, they gathered at the Fox River, candles in hand, flowers carried to the water. It was the first memorial. It would not be the last. Between 2010 and 2012, Daniel Reyes, Charlotte's husband, worked tirelessly to keep her name alive. He appeared on local television, joined radio interviews, and sat on talk shows. His message never changed. The case was not solved, and someone out there knew the truth. Newspapers began using a phrase that stuck: the Aurora nurse mystery. It was simple, memorable, and repeated across Illinois. Meanwhile, Charlotte's young son was growing up without answers, often asking his grandparents the question no one could answer. "Where is Mom?" In 2013, a new tip came in. A man reported seeing a silver Honda Civic abandoned at a salvage yard. Investigators checked the car, ran the VIN, and confirmed it wasn't hers. That same year, an inmate claimed to know what happened to Charlotte. He told detectives he had information from another prisoner. After weeks of questioning, the truth came out. It was a fabricated story designed to cut his own sentence. Leads like these consumed time but delivered nothing. By 2015, patients in the community, Aurora police admitted something many already suspected. Technology in 2008 had limits. The traffic cameras were poor quality. Cell tower data could only narrow locations, not pinpoint them. DNA techniques at the time required larger samples than what was available. Without new tools, detectives could not extract anything more from the old evidence. Then came 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic shut down gatherings, and the annual memorial by the river was canceled. But the family adjusted. They held virtual vigils, live-streamed prayers, and used social media to keep Charlotte's name alive. Images of her were posted and shared, reminding a new generation of followers about the nurse who vanished after her shift. By 2021, it had been 13 long years. The file sat deep in the cold case archive, covered in dust. Detectives rotated in and out of the unit, but no one could break the silence. The Reyes family marked another year at the river, standing in smaller groups, still holding candles. Within the city of Aurora, people spoke of the case with resignation. "It's just one of those mysteries," some said. Others repeated the idea that Charlotte's death had been a tragic accident, her car hidden where no one would ever find it. The official word was harsher. The case was inactive, pending new evidence. By the end of 2021, Charlotte's disappearance had become part of local history. For her family, it was still the present. For police, it was a file waiting for a breakthrough. For the community, it was a question without an answer. The story of a nurse who vanished on her way home, a husband who never stopped asking, and a city that had almost stopped believing. But in less than a year, that would change. The truth, hidden for more than a decade, was waiting under the river. It was May 2022 when a volunteer dive team arrived in Aurora, Illinois. They were known across the country for finding vehicles in lakes and rivers, often tied to long unsolved disappearances. Their tools were simple but powerful: boats, sonar scanners, underwater cameras, and the persistence that had cracked dozens of cold cases before. The Fox River was chosen for a reason. It had always been in the file. In 2008, investigators searched its bank. The team marked the coordinates and circled back. Another pass confirmed it. A car sat about 30 meters from the shoreline, tilted slightly on its side, covered in thick sediment. The find was reported immediately to Aurora police. Within hours, law enforcement closed the section of river, and cranes were brought in to prepare for a recovery operation. Crowds gathered on the riverbank. Some had followed the case for years. Others had only heard of Charlotte Reyes as a local legend, a missing nurse who vanished without explanation. Reporters lined the shore, cameras fixed on the water. The crane lowered cables into the river. Divers secured straps to the vehicle's frame. Slowly, inch by inch, the muddy water broke, and the roof of a silver Honda Civic came into view. The crowd gasped. 15 years of silence were ending in front of their eyes. On shore, investigators confirmed what many already suspected. The VIN number matched Charlotte Reyes's car. After more than a decade of speculation, her vehicle had been found. The next step was evidence. Crime scene technicians examined the car as soon as it was lifted onto the bank. Inside were items frozen in time. A worn leather wallet containing Charlotte's ID and hospital badge. A blue nurse's jacket still lying on the back seat. A damaged cell phone corroded by years underwater. In the glove compartment, personal items that had survived. The kind of small belongings people carry every day. But there was more. Forensic specialists swabbed the steering wheel, the driver's seat, and the gear shift. Mixed in with degraded biological material were traces of DNA that did not belong to Charlotte. It was male. It was strong enough to build a profile. The position of the car also raised questions. Investigators noted the angle, the absence of skid marks on the bank, and the way the vehicle had settled into the mud. It did not appear to have rolled naturally into the water. It looked as though it had been forced or pushed. This was not the sign of an accident. It was the sign of intent. Aurora police reopened the file that same day. What had once been labeled a disappearance was now officially treated as a homicide investigation. Officers who had worked the case For the Reyes family, the discovery was overwhelming. Daniel stood at the site, tears in his eyes, watching the car being loaded onto a flatbed. For 15 years he had repeated the same words. Charlotte is out there. Charlotte will come home. Now he had proof that she never left. Their son, now a teenager, saw the car for the first time. It was a moment both devastating and relieving. Devastating because it confirmed she was gone. Relieving because the mystery was finally cracking open. The community reaction was immediate. People who had once believed it was just an accident began to change their minds. The details released by police, the DNA, the position of the car, pointed to foul play. For years, residents had lived with uncertainty. Now, they had reason to believe a crime had been committed in their own town and left unsolved for more than a decade. Aurora police held a press conference. They confirmed the car belonged to Charlotte. They confirmed the presence of new forensic evidence. They confirmed that investigators were now working with the cold case unit and modern forensic labs to process the DNA. They did not release names. They did not speculate. But they assured the public that progress was being made. The dive team that made the discovery also spoke to reporters. One of them described the moment the sonar image appeared. We knew right away it was a car. We didn't know whose it was, but when we saw the size, the location, we had a feeling. When it came up and the plate was checked, it was her. It was Charlotte. For many, that day marked a turning point. After years of anniversaries with no progress, after vigils that felt like rituals of despair, the Reyes family finally had something tangible, something that could be tested, analyzed, and pursued. But it also raised haunting questions. Who had been in that car with Charlotte? Who had forced it into the river? Why had it taken 15 years for the truth to begin surfacing? Detectives now had new work to do. They sent the swabs for DNA analysis at the state crime lab. They began combing through old records, looking for men with violent histories who lived near Charlotte in 2008. The impact spread beyond Aurora. Families of other missing people contacted the dive team, asking them to check rivers and lakes in their towns. The case showed what technology and determination could uncover, even after so many years. In Aurora, the mood shifted from despair to cautious hope. For 15 years, Charlotte's disappearance had been a question with no answer. Now, the answer was starting to take shape. The car, the belongings, the DNA, these were not just objects pulled from the river. They were evidence. They were the foundation for the next stage of the case. The cold case was no longer cold. It was alive, moving, building towards something long overdue. A trial. A verdict. Justice. And for the first time in over a decade, the Reyes family believed they might finally learn what happened the night Charlotte Reyes left her shift at the hospital and never came home. When Charlotte Reyes's Honda Civic was pulled from the Fox River in 2022, the case shifted from speculation to evidence. Forensic teams wasted no time. They began with the interior of the car, carefully swabbing the steering wheel, gear shift, and driver's seat. Years underwater had damaged much of the material, but enough remained for testing. Within weeks, the results came back. The DNA was male. It did not belong to Charlotte's husband, Daniel. It did not belong to her son, her coworkers, or her friends. The unknown profile was immediately uploaded into CODIS, the national database. Investigators hoped for a hit. They didn't have to wait long. The lab notified Aurora police that the DNA matched a man with a criminal record in Illinois. His name? Miguel Mike Ramirez. Ramirez was no stranger to the system. He had prior arrests for assault and weapons possession. He had lived in Aurora for years, just a few houses down from the Reyes family. Back in 2008, he had been one of the familiar faces at block parties, the type of neighbor who blended into the background. People remembered him grilling food at summer cookouts, waving from his driveway, offering help to those who needed it. For more than a decade, he had even stood alongside the Reyes. On the restored clip, investigators saw two sets of headlights. The first belonged to a compact sedan consistent with Charlotte's Honda Civic. Directly behind it was another vehicle, taller, wider, with the light spread of a pickup truck. The frame was blurred, but the shape was there. Cross-checking DMV records from 2008, detectives found that the red pickup registered to Miguel Ramirez matched the make and model in the clip. What had once been a vague image was now linked to a specific person. The puzzle was coming together. Neighbors were re-interviewed. One woman recalled Ramirez's behavior around the time Charlotte vanished. "Mike was always around," she said. "He'd come by, ask about the family, act like he cared." Back then, it seemed friendly. Now, looking back, it feels different. Another added, "He liked to be in the middle of things, always showing up, even when no one asked him to." With DNA evidence, video footage, and a history of violence, investigators had enough to build a profile. But they needed more. They needed to place Ramirez in direct connection with Charlotte's car on the night she disappeared. Aurora police partnered with the cold case unit to launch a quiet but intensive surveillance operation. Ramirez was followed discreetly. Detectives monitored his phone records, his banking transactions, and his movements. They wanted to know if he would slip, if he would reveal guilt in any way. During this time, analysts revisited old phone tower data from April 2008. They compared signals from Charlotte's phone to those from Ramirez's number. While Charlotte's phone went dark shortly after leaving the hospital, Ramirez's phone pinged off the same towers within the same window of time. The data placed him in the vicinity of her route home. The evidence was stacking higher. Ramirez had the opportunity. He had proximity. He had a vehicle that fit the description. And now, forensic science tied him directly to her car. Investigators kept the family updated. For Daniel and his son, the news was almost too much to process. After years of dead ends, they were hearing that a man they knew, a neighbor they trusted, might have been involved all along. Daniel later said, "It was like living through the last 15 years again, but this time with a name." By the fall of 2022, the surveillance yielded results. Ramirez was observed discarding items in a dumpster behind a hardware store. Detectives retrieved the bags. Inside were gloves and cleaning supplies. Forensics tested them, but no new DNA emerged. Still, the act was suspicious. Combined with the existing case file, it showed a pattern of behavior consistent with someone who had something to hide. At the same time, prosecutors reviewed the evidence. They emphasized 3 pillars: the DNA inside Charlotte's car, the traffic footage showing his red pickup trailing her, and his criminal background. The combination painted a compelling picture. The district attorney's office agreed that the case was strong enough to proceed. In October 2022, Aurora police moved in. Ramirez was arrested at his home without incident. He was charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. The news stunned the neighborhood. For years, Ramirez had been a fixture at community gatherings. He had offered condolences to the Reyes family. To many, he had seemed like the last person capable of such an act. One neighbor, interviewed by local news, said, "He was always at the block parties, always smiling, shaking hands. To think he was hiding something like this. It's unbelievable." The Reyes family was shaken. They had accepted comfort from Ramirez for years, never suspecting he could be responsible. In the following chapter of this case, we will enter the courtroom. Prosecutors will lay out their evidence, defense attorneys will challenge the science, and a jury will decide the fate of Miguel Ramirez. Stay with us as we examine the trial, the verdict, and how a family's 15-year fight for justice finally reached its conclusion. And if you believe stories like Charlotte's must be told, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts below. In October 2022, Aurora police made their move. After months of quiet surveillance and weeks of preparation, they arrived at a modest home on the west side of the city. Inside lived Miguel "Mike" Ramirez, a man long known in the neighborhood as friendly, approachable, and always present at community gatherings. That morning, he was taken into custody without resistance. He was charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping in the disappearance of Charlotte Reyes. The news spread quickly. Residents who had lived alongside Ramirez for years couldn't believe what they were hearing. "He was always at the block parties, always smiling. We never suspected him," one neighbor told reporters. For 15 years, Ramirez had been seen as part of the community's fabric. He grilled food at summer barbecues, helped set up tents for street fairs, and even stood with the Reyes family at vigils. Now, the image of the helpful neighbor was gone. For the Reyes family, the arrest was more than shocking, it was deeply personal. The man accused of killing Charlotte wasn't a stranger passing through town. He was a neighbor, a face they had trusted, someone who had offered condolences, while secretly being linked to their worst loss. Daniel Reyes, Charlotte's husband, spoke through tears. "We trusted him. He stood with us while we were grieving, and now we know the truth." The press wasted no time. Television crews set up outside the Aurora Police Department. Local outlets broke into programming with updates. Within hours, national media picked up the story. Headlines appeared online and in print. Cold case cracked after 15 years. Neighbor arrested in nurse's disappearance. The coverage framed the story in a way that resonated far beyond Aurora. This wasn't just about one of. In Aurora, the reaction was divided. For some, the arrest brought relief. It meant the case that had haunted the city for 15 years finally had an answer. People who had driven past the billboards asking, "Where is Charlotte?" could now believe justice was within reach. But others felt something closer to betrayal. For years, they had welcomed Ramirez into their homes, invited him to parties, trusted him with casual conversations. To discover he had been under suspicion all along left them shaken. One longtime resident said, "It's like finding out the person you sat next to at church, the person you waved to every morning, was living a double life. It changes how you look at everyone." The atmosphere in the neighborhood grew heavy. People replayed old memories in their minds. Ramirez chatting at barbecues, laughing with children, standing quietly at candlelight vigils for Charlotte. Those same moments now looked sinister, as if he had been hiding behind them. Conversations on porches and in local diners circled back to the same question. How could this man live among us for 15 years and no one knew? Aurora police held a press conference days later. Standing at a podium, the lead detective outlined the evidence. DNA recovered from Charlotte's car, enhanced traffic camera footage from 2008, and Ramirez's criminal history. The detective didn't mince words. "This is not speculation," he said firmly. "This is evidence." His statement was meant to assure the public that the arrest was not rushed, that the case had been carefully built. For many, that press conference was a turning point. It reframed the narrative from rumor and disbelief to fact and proof. The Reyes family, present in the front row, listened as investigators explained the work that had led to this moment. The announcement validated the years of vigils, petitions, and pleas for answers. Outside Illinois, the arrest fueled a larger discussion about cold cases and forensic technology. Commentators pointed to the role of DNA, sonar, and data recovery in solving a case once thought unsolvable. News programs emphasized how advances in science had given a voice to victims who had been silenced for years. But within Aurora, the story remained personal. As the case moved toward the courtroom, the community braced for the next stage. Prosecutors would present the science. Defense attorneys would fight back. A jury would have to weigh the evidence and decide Ramirez's fate. The following chapter would no longer be about suspicion or rumor. It would be about the trial. And it would decide whether justice for Charlotte Reyes would finally be delivered. In March 2023, the long-awaited trial of Miguel "Mike" Ramirez began at the Kane County Courthouse in Illinois. The case had haunted Aurora for 15 years, and now it was finally before a jury. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, locals filled the benches, and the Reyes family sat quietly in the front row. From the start, the prosecution built its case around 3 pillars of evidence. The first was the DNA. Forensic experts testified that samples recovered from Charlotte's Honda Civic matched Ramirez's profile with certainty. They explained how modern technology allowed them to extract and confirm the DNA even after years underwater. The second was the car itself. Found submerged in the Fox River, investigators described it not as an accident scene, but as a concealed crime scene. And the third was traffic camera footage from 2008. Though blurry, enhancements showed a red pickup following Charlotte's Civic on the night she vanished. Records confirmed that Ramirez owned such a truck at the time. To strengthen their argument, prosecutors called forensic specialists to the stand. One explained the process in clear terms, how trace genetic material was isolated, tested, and matched. Another walked the jury through the digital restoration of the traffic footage, showing side-by-side comparisons of the raw tape and the enhanced image. Jurors leaned forward as investigators recounted the years of dead ends before technology finally caught up with the evidence. The lead detective described the painstaking surveillance that led to Ramirez's arrest. He told the jury about reanalyzing tower data from 2008, showing Ramirez's phone moving along the same route as Charlotte's car. He detailed how Ramirez was observed discarding items during the months of surveillance, adding to the suspicion that he was hiding something. They reminded the jury that suspicion alone was not proof. Their client, they claimed, was a man caught in a web of coincidences, unfairly accused because he happened to live near the Reyes family and owned a common type of vehicle. But the prosecution countered. They didn't need a single eyewitness, they argued, because the science was undeniable. They pointed to SODIS matches, the unbroken chain of custody for the evidence, and the consistency between the DNA, the car, and the video. One prosecutor told the jury, "This is not theory, this is evidence, and it all points in one direction." Witnesses from the community added a chilling dimension. Neighbors recalled Ramirez attending vigils for Charlotte, bringing food to gatherings, and offering condolences to the grieving family. The prosecution used those stories to argue that Ramirez wasn't just guilty of the crime, but had also manipulated the community to shield himself from suspicion. He stood with them, knowing what he had done, one prosecutor said, a statement that drew quiet gasps from the gallery. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense throughout. Jurors listened closely, taking notes during the technical explanations. The Reyes family sat silently, their faces fixed, as years of anguish were laid out in evidence and testimony. Members of the Aurora community watched from the gallery, some shaking their heads as each detail was revealed. When closing arguments came, the prosecution urged the jury to see the whole picture. They reminded them of the DNA, the submerged car, the video evidence, the cell tower data, and the history of violence in Ramirez's past. The defense, in turn, pleaded with the jury not to convict based on circumstantial links, and challenged them to consider the possibility of doubt. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman stood and announced the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. Ramirez showed little reaction as the judge pronounced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Reyes family, the moment was overwhelming. 15 years after Charlotte vanished, justice had finally been delivered. The trial was the final chapter in the courtroom. But for the community and the family, the story continued. What remained was reflection, remembrance, and the enduring lesson that justice, though delayed, could still be achieved. In the spring of 2023, weeks after the trial ended, the Reyes family gathered at the Fox River once more. But this time it was different. They were not there to search, not there to beg for leads. They were there to honor. A candlelight vigil was held at the same spot where the family had stood every year since 2008. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues joined them. Nurses from Rush Copley Medical Center came in uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder with community members. In front of the crowd stood a small stone marker. Etched into it were the words, "Justice may be delayed, but never forgotten." It was a simple message, but it carried the weight of 15 years of waiting. The community that once feared there would never be answers now had the truth. The vigil was not just about remembrance. It was also about what came next. Rush Copley Medical Center announced the creation of the Charlotte Reyes Nursing Scholarship. The scholarship would provide financial support for nursing students, keeping Charlotte's name alive in the very profession she loved. For her colleagues, it was a way to ensure that the care she gave to patients would continue through others. One nurse said quietly, "Charlotte never got to finish her journey, but now others will carry it forward in her name." Beyond Aurora, the case had lasting effects on the justice system. Law enforcement agencies in Illinois began using the Reyes case as a training example for cold case units. Detectives in other states studied it as well. The combination of sonar, forensic DNA, and data recovery became a model for how old mysteries could still be solved. The Illinois legislature also responded. New funding was approved to expand cold case divisions and to invest in modern forensic technology. State officials pointed to the Reyes investigation as proof that investment in science directly led to justice. For many, it was no longer just about Charlotte's case. In Aurora, the neighborhood finally found a measure of peace. After years of suspicion and whispers, the truth was public. People who had once believed Charlotte's disappearance was an accident now knew what had really happened. The story of the nurse who never made it home was no longer just a question. It was an answer, carried through the work of investigators, the persistence of her family, and the memory of a community that refused to forget. The legacy of Charlotte Reyes is not only a tragic story. It is also a reminder that time does not erase the possibility of justice. Her name now lives in the scholarship that will help future nurses, in the case files studied by new investigators, and in the memory of Aurora itself. 15 years after she vanished, Aurora closed one of its darkest chapters. Charlotte Reyes's story proved that justice may come slowly, but it does come, and her name will never disappear. If this case moved you, let us know what you think in the comments. Do you believe other long-forgotten cold cases can be solved the same way? Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this story so more people can see how justice, even delayed, can still be delivered. And stay with us. Our next case takes us to another shocking disappearance that remained unsolved for years.